Allan Kessing, thank you for this interview.
You're welcome.
To begin with, could I actually ask, what are your views of the predicament that Schapelle Corby is in?
Well, when it first arose, I couldn't believe the case was going ahead because it was well known within the Customs Service and all of the law enforcement that there was a terrible problem with corruption in baggage handling at Sydney Airport. And I thought it would be just a matter of time before it was seen what the problem was.
Why wasn't it seen?
I'm sorry?
Why wasn't the problem seen after all this time?
There is too much. It is not that nobody knows, it is just that they cannot acknowledge it. It's the elephant in the room problem, that to have a clean-out, to correct things, would disrupt too many small empires and there'll be too many turf battles. People tend to forget that Qantas is the employer of the baggage handlers, and Qantas is Sydney Airport. And since Sydney Airport has been privatised, the last thing they need or want or will allow is any disruption to the flow-through of traffic. Now, you've only got to think that airports, people tend to think airports are about flying, but they're not. They're just giant travelling centres, just giant shopping centres with a few airlines attached. When Sydney Airport has 50,000 people come in, 50,000 people go out each day, plus all the meeters and greeters. Now, any shopping centre would give pay very high rents for that sort of passing traffic, and that's why nothing will ever be done to correct the problems, because they don't want to disrupt that traffic. It's a commercial imperative. There are too many people with too much to lose.
Allan, you were a former customs officer. At one point, you were appointed to do a review of airport services. Am I correct in terms of corruption within airport services and the movement of illicit drugs?
Specifically on the security aspects of traffic in and out of Sydney Airport at the time, yes. And I did two reports, one of them specifically on the so-called security staff, and another larger one on employees in general and the corruption, which is pretty prevalent there. I did those reports in 2002 and 2003, and they were both rejected, or suppressed would be a better way of putting it, and never acted upon, although I did find out many years later at my trial in 2007 that in fact my reports had been uploaded into the Australian Federal Police intelligence database in November-December 2004, so that when Mick Keelty claimed that there was during Schapelle Corby's trial that there was no evidence of corruption, that information was already in the Federal Police database.
So whether former Commissioner Keelty was aware of that report or not, and he may not have been, the report did exist, and therefore with the AFP, and could have been presented and therefore to Schapelle Corby's lawyers, and then therefore to the Indonesian court.
Well, as I say, it was in their database because it emerged at my trial in 2007 that two seconded customs officers, that is, two customs officers who'd been seconded to the AFP on a long-term basis, had put my reports into the AFP system. So whether Keelty personally knew of it is less relevant than the fact that the information was there and his statements were untrue.
In terms of your report, what are you able to tell us? Are you able to tell us the extent of what you found out in terms of what you reported as corruption amongst baggage handlers and the movement of, for instance, illicit drugs?
Well, corruption is endemic. It is the price we pay for the smooth movement of traffic, that is, passengers and goods through airports. It's the same on the wharves. In retail shopping, it's called shrinkage, and what they basically mean is that staff pilfering. So a certain amount of corruption is just considered to be the price of doing smooth business. It's a wink and a nod, and as long as it doesn't get too outrageous everybody just ignores it.
Were there incidences reported in your report of, for instance, similar circumstance to Schapelle Corby, people being used as unwitting drug mules by airport handlers?
Well, the point is, there is any number of cases that have come to light where people have got home and found unknown substances or unknown items in their baggage, and when they've reported it to the authorities, it's almost always, well, it is always, a case of they were being used unwittingly, simply as unwitting mules. The point is, we don't know about it because mostly they're very efficient at it. So people put locks and things on their bags, but it's the work of a few seconds to open a bag, no matter how securely sealed, and then reseal it, and most passengers would never know their bag's been with.
But whether passengers know it or not, airport authorities obviously know that this is something that occurs. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been appointed or selected to investigate. The AFP knows, and obviously the relevant government authorities and agencies must know. Should they not have had an obligation to produce your reports, which were 20304 to the 205 trial of Schapelle Corby?
Well, they had both a moral and ethical obligation, but as I say, commercial imperative always tops such considerations. To admit that there is a problem would surely leave them open to the public demanding something be done, and that, as I say, the disruption that would be caused to really have root and branch reform, as Jason Clare, the ex-Minister for Justice, put it, basically see the airport shut down, and there's no way that's going to happen.
Are you saying that this foundational reform can't occur because it would go to cost benefit? It would.
Yes, exactly that. In fact, that was the reason we were given for my reports being suppressed, that the enforcement of the Customs Act would have cost the privatised airport corporation too much money, and that's what suppressed. My reports were suppressed and the recommendations therein, and even after they were leaked by persons unknown in 2005, and John Howard commissioned Sir John Wheeler, the British aviation security expert. He looked at my reports and endorsed every one of the recommendations and made the same recommendations. Howard promised $200 million to rectify the situation, and 7 years later, we still have Jason and O'Connor talking about root and branch reform, and a broken customs system was the latest comment he made just before the election. He's saying that we cannot reform the customs system; it needs to be totally rebuilt from the ground up, I think was the last comment he made, and that was endorsed by Pizzoli, who is the current CEO of Customs.
So then, therefore, 7 years later, 8 years later, passengers should still fear may occur to them what occurred to Schapelle Corby. Nothing's changed, is what you're saying.
Nothing's changed. Colleagues who are still in the service tell me there's not been a blind bit of difference.
If we can go back to your report, and it was attributed wrongly to you once the report was leaked to the media, that you were the person who obviously must have leaked it. Well, why did they take you to court, and under what premise?
Well, because I was the person who wrote them, I guess they just saw me as the easiest target, because I'd already resigned. I'd retired, in fact. In fact, I'd stayed on after retirement age specifically to do these reports as a special request from my senior officer. So once I'd retired, I was no longer would have had the protection of the CPSU, the representation. So they just figured I'd be the easy target.
What did they charge you with?
Well, I was charged under Section 70 of the Crimes Act, subsection 2, which is the disclosure of information acquired whilst in service. The actual indictment said that I'd given the reports to two named journalists at the Australian, although that was changed two-thirds of the way through the trial. In the second or the third trial, the indictment was changed, which is almost unheard of, to disclose information to persons unknown. Now, the Crown was basically obliged by the judge at the time, at the opening of the trial, to subpoena the two named journalists. When they didn't respond to the subpoenas, the judge asked the Crown, seek enforcement now, and the Crown said, no, I have been ordered by my superior not to seek enforcement of the subpoenas. Now, a subpoena is the most powerful judicial instrument we have, and I defy anybody with an interest in jurisprudence to find an example of a Crown issuing a subpoena and not seeking enforcement of it. And considering that those two journalists were mentioned in the indictment, they didn't call them, they subpoenaed them, and then they didn't enforce the subpoena. And I would suggest that that has never occurred in Australian court procedure.
For the benefit of listeners, could you tell us the outcome of that court?
It was a 3-week trial. The jury sat for 3.5 days. They couldn't reach a verdict. And on the 24th day, they came back in after, I think it was 22 different questions that they'd put back to the judge, and said, we can't reach a verdict. And the judge said, well, I want a verdict. I'll arrange for an evening meal for you. And they went away and came back 20 minutes later and said, we find the defendant guilty. I was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment, suspended for 9 months on my own recognizance. And even at the sentencing, the judge, the opening statement of the judge at the sentencing was something my barrister had never heard before. As soon as he'd walked in and we'd all sat down, first thing he said was, I will be releasing Mr. Kessing immediately these proceedings are finished. My barrister's jaw dropped open, and the judge then read out the verdict and the sentence, and that was the end of that, and I walked out. $100,000 poorer, but relatively free.
Allan, it's actually an extraordinary situation and predicament you found yourself in Australia, despite the Whistleblower Acts in the various jurisdictions in our nation not being protective of whistleblowers. It's not often that we hear in this country that even if you were the whistleblower, which you were not, that someone is taken to court for it.
Well, there have been other cases where the government has sought to prosecute people who have leaked information embarrassing to the government, but let's not imagine that leaks are only from individuals. Governments leak all the time. You've only got to look at the Dr. Hanif affair.
Yes.
The leaks in that case by Kevin Andrews, who was the minister at the time, they were actually untrue, the things he was leaking. There is a well-known case of Andrew Wilkie. Andrew Bolt wrote, I have read, and this is what Andrew Bolt actually wrote, I have read the only report Andrew Wilkie ever wrote for ONA, and it is a worthless document. So the question you have to ask is, how did Andrew Bolt come to read Andrew Wilkie's report, which is a top-secret document? And eventually the AFP lumbered into action, and it took them 18 months, and they couldn't find out how Andrew Bolt got that report, even though only one copy had been signed out at the time, and that copy was signed out to Lord Bunter of Downer.
It's still amazing that you finished up in court. It's still an amazing predicament, extraordinary predicament. And obviously it's had impacts on you. You're financially poorer. And you're...
It cost me my entire superannuation, yeah.
Oh, that's disastrous, and that's actually shocking. But it's just amazing. I just wonder what you feel. Well, you've said the reason... You've imputed that it's suppression, that they wanted you not to voice anything that was embarrassing to the government, despite it being the truth.
That's right. Truth is no defence in these cases. It's merely a matter of embarrassing those in power. I mean, I think the old phrase is, those who speak truth to power better have a big shield and a hard head.
In terms of your report, did it cover all Australian airports, or
No, I only examined the situation at Sydney Airport, but I wouldn't imagine it was any different. And from what I've heard from ex-colleagues, it's very similar in Melbourne and elsewhere.
so what Schapelle Corby has claimed, and her legal team has claimed, that the drugs, or the cannabis, the 4 kilograms of cannabis, were planted at Queensland and were to be planted at Brisbane domestic and were to be retrieved at Sydney domestic by airport handlers and then passed on. Is that a likely scenario?
It's very possible, very probable. In fact, we do know that on the day that she made the flight, she would have had to fly down from Brisbane and then change to the international in Sydney. We do know at the time that there was a delayed cocaine shipment coming in from Argentina, and the baggage handler team, which was meant to be working at the domestic that day, had changed the roster, and they were waiting for the cocaine to come in because Customs was well aware of this, and all the Customs surveillance and observation was concentrated on this cocaine shipment.
So because of that, the airport baggage handlers, you're saying, that who were intended to retrieve the cannabis from Schapelle's bag were spooked and did not retrieve it?
I think more likely, if you think of the relative values, they just went for the bigger prize. Incidentally, that cocaine shipment got through for all the surveillance. It was ineffective.
How do we know that?
We do know that. Okay. I can't tell you how, but
okay, no, I won't ask any further then. In terms of cannabis, though, in your experience, is cannabis trafficked from Australia to a country such as Indonesia or to Bali?
I think the phrase is Coles to Newcastle.
Well, that's the big question. And as far as I know, and I don't know if you can tell me otherwise, although you've made the analogy Coles to Newcastle, there's no other known incidents of someone trafficking cannabis
out of Australia. I've never ever heard of it. In the 15 years I worked for Customs, I have never heard of such a thing. We are a drug importing country. We are not a drug exporting country.
And certainly we wouldn't be exporting cannabis, which would sell at a higher value on the streets, Australian city streets, than would be on the streets of Bali. It just makes no sense.
By a factor of about 100, I would have thought, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's the question that should mind-boggle a lot of people, but it doesn't seem to get much play in the media or from government authorities, and I thought that's actually a very foundational question.
Yeah, well, in all legal matters, you always have to look for a motive. Now, what possible motive would there have been to do such a strange thing? And that alone should have set the authorities wondering what the mechanism was. But yeah, taking cannabis to Bali does seem a very strange thing to do, given the disparity in price.
Another question, is the movement of cannabis commonplace, or even if irregular, does it occur through Australian airports domestically?
There have been any number of reports of innocent passengers getting home and finding unknown items in their baggage. Yes, it's a well-known phenomenon, and it crops up in the media a couple of times a year. But yes, it's not unknown. The only point is the times we hear about it are obviously only a fraction of the times it occurs, because normally they're fairly efficient at placing it in and taking it out. People go to all the trouble of locking their bags and that, but it's the work of a few to open, any bag and then reseal it. People will be shocked at just how easy it is, no matter how well you think you've done up your bag. In fact, locking up your bag is one of the surest ways of exciting criminal interest. Oh, I wonder why that bag's locked. Maybe there's something valuable in there.
I'll ask you another question. You may or may not be able to answer it. When you talked about surveillance that day and the cocaine nevertheless still got through, it was October 8, 2004. On that particular day, which was that Operation Mocha, the New South Wales Crime Commission's Operation Mocha that was in place, led by the former...
I can't say that.
Okay, if you can't say that, you can't say that. Can you say anything about Operation Mocha?
No.
No, fair enough. Are you still surprised after the variable awareness raising and the expendable project, the researchers that have worked the last couple of years, that they've Schapelle Corby still languishing in a Bali prison, 10 years later, 9.5, and that the work of the expendable researchers in thereabouts meticulously putting together a compilation of interviews and testimonies and other revelations, and some by other whistleblowers, and also the William Moss admission, that none of this has effectively gone into the light of day. Not commercial television, not mainstream media, and our governments haven't been pushing their counterparts in Indonesia after all these revelations from so many others.
Well, of course I'm astounded at the inaction, but when you think of, there are so many people with so much, lose either reputations in politics and law enforcement, and or even in the media. I mean, the fact that they didn't cover the story more assiduously and with more attention to detail, I think there's just too many people are just too embarrassed over their whole failure to act at the time, and now it's 7 years later, and they certainly don't want it raised again.
Well, if I was to tell you, I've read the Wheeler report, there's your report, and it describes, as you said earlier, endemic and pernicious or rampant corruption within airport services, that it does happen, and it happens regularly, or if irregularly often. There's also WikiLeaks released Stratfor email cable that was released as part of a cache of emails on the 27th of February. And I'll forward it on to you because I know you haven't read it. We spoke about it before you went on air. But the Stratfor email was by a tactical analyst named Mark Primorak, who describes what you describe, who describes it, one, globally, but also target specific to Australian airport services, rampant and endemic corruption amongst airport baggage handlers, and the regular practice to move, for instance, cannabis around the country and other illicit drugs is to take on unwitting passengers who are forever unaware, unless they're caught out with them, or they find them, in a hotel room if the illicit materials have not been retrieved. That there's the practice of drug mules by airport baggage handlers from one Australian airport to another. And that email from Mark Primorak of Stratfor also refers to Schapelle Corby as innocent. But how do you feel when you see one of the world's most major intelligence gathering and information gathering agencies who report to major organizations such as the US Defense Department, the Pentagon, Homeland Security, the major corporations around the world, when they come out and say everything that you've said, and yet our governments aren't prepared to publicly take a stand on it, other than what Jason Clare did as a result of a customs officer having been caught out at Sydney Airport drug trafficking?
Well, as I've often said, those in law enforcement know what the truth of the situation is, but to get the political masters to act upon it is the real problem. It's because they have built their careers on so often on being strong on law and order, but they're always a year out for the commercial considerations, and truly effective interdiction of drugs or other criminal activity basically would disrupt so many commercial patterns. I mean, we were talking about the airport and the movement of passengers to and fro, and the high rents the various commercial enterprises pay to have their shops in those areas, and the same thing applies on the wharves with shipping. The largest amount of hard drugs, that is the heroin and the cocaine, cocaine tends to come in by the airport, but only because of geographical consideration. But heroin comes in 100, 200 kilo lots via sea cargo, and to effectively stop it would mean examining the shipping cargo much more in a much more complicated way, and that simply won't happen because of the commercial disruption. It's been pointed out over and over and over that customs is in the business of facilitation and interdiction, but facilitation is 99% of our mission statement. I mean, I hate that sort of PR speak, but that is actually customs' aim, is facilitation of legitimate and interdiction illegitimate. Well, if you've got a 99% to 1% resource allocation, then you can just expect illegal activity to flourish.
In closing, Allan, and I'm not here to sensationalise, I just want us to get to the brutal facts, the reality, and what may or may not have happened to Schapelle Corby and what may or may not occur around our airports. And obviously it does occur from, reading the number of reports, Wheeler, yourself, the Stratfor's Mark Primorak report, and also the just general knowledge that we all do have about what obviously goes on in the world. But we have to draw some pessimistic conclusions after listening to what you've said. The reality is that our airports are growing, our traffic of passengers and flights are growing and will continue on an exponential level. In 2020, we'll probably have double the number of flights and demands upon our airport services. Is it only going to get easier for the movement of, for instance, illicit drugs and other materials through our airports?
Well, I think so, especially because with the terrorism focus that we have, all the so-called security measures of, making you take your shoes off, your belt off, and passing through the metal detectors, all that is just theatre. There never in the history of air travel ever been a terrorist stopped at boarding anywhere in the world. It is a simple fact. All of that is purely to reassure the public and make it look as if they're doing something. And all that sort of thing costs money, and the money, the resources are being devoted to that purely for theatre and purely for PR, and effective interdiction is not occurring.
Allan Kessing, thank you.
Thank you.